Hello again, everyone. Edwin Learnard back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I am going to be talking about Mercury in astrology. Now, as far as Mercury goes in astrology, Mercury is connected with communication, neighbors, siblings, cousins, short journeys, assimilating, processing information, and also dissemination of information. Now, Mercury by sign can show how one communicates in contrast to house position where it's where the person communicates and what sector of life is the person injecting their communications into. Now, Mercury, of course, it's in its dignity in Gemini and Virgo, and it is in its detriment in Sagittarius and fall and detriment in the sign of Pisces. Mercury in Virgo can think systematically and methodically. Gemini Mercury can have a versatile mind and ability to comprehend virtually any subject. Now, Sagittarius Mercury, on one positive side of it, can be visionary, but they often, Mercury in Sagittarius often draws conclusions too quickly before assimilating all the details. Now, Pisces Mercury can be intuitive, may even be prophetic in some cases, at least on a light scale, but it's not always logical and orderly, and they can overlook significant and essential details. Now, Mercury by house can show where communication is injected to, as I was stating before. Let's take an example by sign and house for Mercury. Now, let's say Mercury is in Capricorn in one's 6th house. Well, the person's may be rather introspective and have very disciplined thinking in work-related matters, but not necessarily inject maybe may not inject a lot of originality and ingenuity into their thinking, whether it is over work or health-related matters, which is the 6th house, of course. So anyway, now generally speaking, as far as aspects go to Mercury, well, let's say in a chart, if Mercury has predominantly good aspects, this can often indicate somebody that is able to get their messages off very clearly in very lucid manner. It can diminish miscommunications and things being misconstrued by others, and often the person can make themselves readily understood. And also it could show a good rapport and relationship with siblings if applicable, and neighbors and even cousins. Now, let's take another example in contrast to that. Let's say if the opposite is true, and let's say somebody has predominantly adverse aspects to their natal Mercury in their chart and has a very strongly afflicted Mercury. Now, this person may have trouble making themselves readily understood. There might be a lot of things they say that may be ambiguous or misconstrued, and just general miscommunications in things, and also the relationship, if applicable, if the person has any siblings, they may not be the best. There might be some contentious situations with them, and also perhaps with cousins and or even neighbors, there may be more difficulties. Now, the thing about this is my Mercury is strongly afflicted. It makes a number of adverse aspects in my chart. And to be honest with you, it's interesting is that I have no siblings. I have very little communication with my cousins. And there have been certain contentious situations with neighbors in the past. And what doesn't help me, as far as the no sibling situation, many of you may know, I've said this in some other videos I've made in the past, I have the ruler of the 12th house of restrictions in the 3rd house of siblings, and that ruler is Mars, and Mars in the 3rd house can sometimes combat things. I mean, in this case, perhaps it combated siblings, brothers and or sisters. So anyway, now another thing is aspects to Mercury, individual aspects, are important in the chart. They can impact one's communication to some degree. Now, let's say that somebody has Mercury making an adverse aspect to their natal Jupiter in their chart. Well, this could be somebody that might have a tendency to enlarge or distort events and expand upon them, and where it's, where there may be, this person may be embellishing some facts or embellishing stories. That might actually not be bad if you're writing a story or fiction story, but in real life, of course, that's not always good. But anyway, another thing is, let's take another example. Let's say a positive aspect to Mercury in the natal chart. Let's say somebody has Mercury sextile or trine their Uranus in their chart. This could be somebody that is able to often incorporate ingenuity into their communications. The person may really be short of new ideas and new concepts to talk about. So anyway, well, another thing as far as this goes, we'll talk about Mercury if it is retrograde. Well, retrograde Mercury can be about a lot more review before speaking and writing. There might be more subtle and indirect manner of one's communication. Now, another thing is talk about if Mercury is intercepted in a natal chart. Well, Mercury is intercepted. This could show a lot of vacillation and distortion of the energy of Mercury. You might have somebody that might be loquacious and very talkative one moment and talk nonstop practically. Then the next minute they could become very taciturn, very quiet, and go for protracted periods, perhaps without talking. So anyway, take something else about Mercury. Let's say we take an unaspected Mercury, which of course could be rather rare. But if Mercury is unaspected, well, for one thing, I mean, keep in mind when you have an unaspected planet in the natal chart, it's not operating in the same manner that it would be if it had a number of aspects. Now, let's say if you have Mercury, if you have Mercury that is unaspected, well, this could indicate perhaps somebody that is very voluble, very talkative, maybe about things that might not always be that important, or it could be somebody that might talk a lot more inopportune times than not. It could also be somebody that may be very talkative about insignificant things, but then when something significant or maybe needs to be addressed, then they might not quite be as talkative or really as vocal as you would think the person would need to be. And keep in mind that Mercury also rules over siblings, our neighbors, even cousins. So if somebody has an unaspected Mercury, it's kind of left alone without making any aspects, and there might be a little bit of a disconnect from siblings, from cousins, and even neighbors, and they might not. There really might not be much communication or really have much rapport with any of these people. So anyway. Well, the next thing talk about as far as Mercury goes. Now, the thing about it is it's also important to look at the transits of Mercury, because it can show how and maybe where communication can be directed at the time based on the transit. Now, let's say that transit Mercury was in your natal fourth house and it was in Aquarius. Now, this could be somebody that maybe might be talking a lot about new concepts, innovations, new ideas in the home, in the family, talking to family members regarding this. Keep in mind too, though, that Mercury is over thieves as well. So at this time by transit, I think there'd be a little greater propensity for perhaps items being maybe stolen, perhaps in the home. That might be ones that might be Aquarius, like such as computer and electronic like items. So anyway, the next thing is, let's say let's look at transiting aspects by Mercury. Let's say, for example, that transit Mercury is making a square opposition or even an inconjunct to your natal Mercury. Well, this could be a time where you might have a little bit more difficulty assimilating information, where things might get more misconstrued in communications, where things might be a little bit more cryptic or ambiguous. You might even find yourself writing or saying things that might be a little bit more cryptic at this time than usual. It might be more difficulty in articulating messages to siblings, if applicable, neighbors, and even cousins. I mean, there might be difficulties in communications with those. And also, let's take another example of transit Mercury. Let's say that transit Mercury is making a sextile or trine to your natal Uranus. This could be a good idea, a good time perhaps for expressing things that are progressive, that are ingenious, and that are new, talking about new ideas and maybe having some of your own to articulate and verbalize. Well, another thing to look at too is Mercury in a progress chart. Now let's say, for example, let's say that somebody has a transit Mercury, let's say in Scorpio, in their 5th house. I'm sorry, let's say somebody has progressed Mercury in Scorpio in their 5th house. Well, this could suggest a lot of incisive communications at this time, perhaps with children and or people, maybe somebody they're in a romantic relationship with. And at the same time, keep in mind about what I stated before, that there can be, Mercury also governs thieves. So it could be that maybe you might have a child, maybe that might experience some robbery, or maybe even someone you're in a romantic relationship with, and done in a rather sneaky and surreptitious Scorpio-like manner, so to speak. And anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment for Mercury in astrology. Stay tuned next time, where I'll be talking about Venus in astrology. 2 things I want to get with you on before I head out. Firstly, the stars may impel, but do not compel. And secondly, never isolate any single astrological element, aspect, planetary placement, position, configuration, influence, or what have you, and make an analysis of a person, astrologically speaking, based on this alone, because astrologically speaking, the person is the sum of all their components in their natal chart and not just one. Until next time, people, stay well.